Said that this year is going to be Tefillah, and while I look forward to having the shiur back at Hadassah's house as soon as we possibly can, I appreciate everybody who is here despite not having a special breakfast arranged and all of the usual decor, and hopefully just the fact that we're learning about Tefillah will be worthwhile, even without breakfast. There are a lot of routes we could go when we're talking about davening, and I put some of this in the email that I sent out the other day. We could talk about understanding the goals of Tefillah. What are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to change Hashem's mind? Are we improving ourselves? Are we reminding God we exist? What exactly is it that we're doing? We could look at particular tefillos, particular davening, the daily ones, the special ones, the Korban Tefillah. One thing that I've actually really been enjoying over the last few months, despite or because of COVID, depending on how you look at it, is we've had a practice in my family going back to when my wife and I first got married, that on Shabbos, when we're about to bench at each meal, so we learn something. And for a long time it's been Shmir Shabbos Kehilchasa. But I decided to switch over to Siddur and just going through each, paragraph by paragraph of the davening. And my kids are now old enough that they're actually able to suggest things and analyze things. And just because I mentioned learning particular tefillos and Korban Tefillah, I've gotten a lot out of that, and hopefully if we get to that point where we're doing particular paragraphs, everyone will be able to bring something to the table in terms of analyzing paragraph by paragraph what it is that we're saying in the davening, what we're supposed to learn from the structure, and so on. Possibly this year we'll also look at strategies for improving tefillah. What are the challenges? How can we meet them? I'm really open to angling the series whichever way people want. So, we don't need to have that conversation quite right now, but at some point I'm going to ask you, after we get through sort of introductory things, which way you want to go with the series. But for the beginning, I want to go back to the start of davening in the Torah and the relationship between Tefillah and Karbanos. It's not what people often say. If you take a look at the first source on the sheet, this is from an article by Professor Nathan Aviezer. You may be familiar with his work in terms of physics and Bereshis, in trying to show that you could explain Bereshis via modern physics. An interesting endeavor. Works a little bit, maybe some challenges, but that's not what he's talking about here. This is from an article that he wrote on Parshas Tzav. And from the beginning of his article, he writes, "B'parshatenu, in our parsha, haTorah mamshicha lefareit et hilchot hakorbanot." Everyone has the sheet, right? Okay? All right. So he says, in our parsha, the Torah continues to explain the laws of korbanos. Lahalan nidon bekesher shebein hakorbanos letfilos lefi hakviyah shel Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. I switched over to Ashkenazis based on who I see on the Zoom. If someone else joins and it's Sfaradit, then maybe I'll switch over. We'll see. But he says further along in his article, he says we're going to deal with the connection between Korban and davening. Lefi hakviyah shel Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, according to what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi established. What did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi establish? Tfilos keneged temidin, parentheses karbanos, tiknu. He writes, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that tefillah, davening, was established opposite karbanos, parallel to the karbanos. And that's a Gemara in Brachos, which we're going to see a little bit later. You've heard that idea before? That the tfilos that we daven, Shachris Mincha Maariv, the Shemona Esrei in particular, was created in parallel to the Korban Tamid? Yeah. Okay, that's a familiar idea. I mean, those who are not visible on the screen, I can't tell whether you're nodding your head yes or not. So I don't know if you want to just unmute and chime in, or let it go. But I'm assuming that everybody understands unless they tell me otherwise. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that davening is enacted, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, well, not Mariv, but Shachris and Mincha are enacted opposite the Karbanos, specifically the Korban Tamid, the morning Korban Tamid, the afternoon Korban Tamid, these two daily offerings. Mariv is a separate discussion, which we may come around to at some point. But what he says next is what I wanted to pick up on. He says, Klomar, what Yeshua ben Levi is trying to say is, Chazal tiknu tfilos kitachlif lekorbanos shebutlu im churban beis hamikdash. What Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying is that our sages enacted the Shmona Esreis as a replacement for the korbanos which were canceled, which were halted, with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. True or false? What he just said, that last line. Was Shmona Esrei enacted as a replacement for the korbanos that were halted with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? No. How do you know?
Because it's mentioned when Hannah davened quietly, that was when Shemona Esrei was decided to be a prayer that's quiet.
So, based on Chana, yes, but not at the time of Chana. In other words, I wouldn't use that as evidence. The Gemara in Brachos does say that we learn various great halachos from the way Chana davened, one of which is she davened silently, and we learn silent Shemona Esrei from there. However, it's not that day they stood up and did it. I wouldn't use that necessarily as evidence.
Don't we see it even as far back as the Avos? The concept of tefillah, like the concept of...
So we're going to have to come back to that. The Gemara, that same Gemara in Brachos, indeed talks about it being parallel to the Avos. However, it doesn't seem like we're saying that our Shmona Esrei goes back to the Avos. We'll see. It's not really so clear. It could be argued that it's back to the Avos. But I think you have a very clear basis. Sorry? Right. The concept for sure goes back to the Avos. We're going to discuss the davening that the Avos did. We're going to bring specific examples. And we're going to see that they davened morning, afternoon, evening, which that Gemara does note. It's only that I wouldn't put Shmona Esrei on them. First of all, I mean, the Gemara is going to tell us Shmona Esrei is a much later creation. But the idea of davening 3 times a day, you are correct, is based on practices we find with the Avos. I actually use a different source just because it's one that's so clear-cut that to me it just seems ideal. If you take a look at source number 2, Pasuk in Daniel, this is in the beginning of the reign of a king identified in the book of Daniel as Darius the Mede, Daryavesh Hamadi, and Darius at first does not seem very interested in running his kingdom. They defeated the Babylonians. The Persians and the Medes defeat the Babylonians, but he doesn't seem interested in running the kingdom himself. He appoints 120 people to be in charge of the kingdom, and there are 3 people who are in charge over them. But his advisors really don't like Daniel, who happens to be one of the 3, who's running the kingdom. And so they seek to undermine him. And the way they do it is they say to Darius, you're running your kingdom this way with people reporting to other people. You're undermining your own central authority. That's not healthy. So what we suggest is that for a month, for the next 30 days, anybody in the kingdom, I think it's in the capital city. I don't think it's in the kingdom as a whole. But in any case, anybody who wants anything can't ask anybody for it. Not a government official, not a friend, not a god. Anybody who wants anything has to go to you. Establish yourself as the authority in charge of the kingdom. That's what they tell him. And Darius accepts the idea. But what they're doing is meant to undermine Daniel, because they know that Daniel davens regularly. And so once they see Daniel appeal to Hashem, they're going to use that as a means of undermining Daniel. And that's what happens. That's how he ends up being thrown in the lion's den. So take a look at source number 2, the pasuk. V'Daniel kidi yidadi rishim ksava. When Daniel found out that this decree had been recorded, al labaise, he went up to his house. V'chavin psichon le be'ilisei neged Yerushalayim. He had windows open in the upper floor of his house opposite Yerushalayim. Because going back to Shlomo, we said Jews should daven towards the Beis HaMikdash. And yes, that's another piece of evidence that they're davening already in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. But look at this. V'zimnin tlasa biyomahu bareich al birchohi. 3 times a day, he would kneel. The umitzalei umodei kadam elakei. And he would daven and thank towards his God, kol kavel v'hu aved min kadmazdana, as he had done before, meaning before he was taken into exile in Bavel. Back in the first Beis HaMikdash, Daniel is davening 3 times a day. So I like this pasuk, just because it's so clear cut that this was going on in the time of the first Beis HaMikdash. Also, source number 2, the Gemara in Megillah, which tells us how Shmona Esrei came to be Shmona Esrei. Shimon HaPakuli histir Shmona Esrei brachos lifnei Rabbi Gamliel al HaSeder b'Yavne. The sage Shimon HaPakuli arranged 18 brachos in front of Rabbi Gamliel in order in Yavne. Now, you'll say Yavne, that's the end of the second Beis HaMikdash. But Rabbi Yochanan va'amrila b'masnisa Tana, Rabbi Yochanan said, or some had it as a brisa, Mea ve'esrim zikanim, 120 sages, uvahem kama neviim, including prophets, tiknu Shmona Esrei brachos al HaSeder, they set the structure of Shmona Esrei. Now, 120 chachamim, including neviim, is a reference to the Anshe Knesses Hagdola, the Great Assembly, which is the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. So how can you tell me that Tefillah is somehow a replacement for Korbanos that were lost? They were doing this while they were bringing Korbanos. Daniel did it. Anshe Knesses Hagdola enacted Shmona Esrei. Shlomo. The Avos had some form of davening, although again, it's not quite the same as what we do. But what is their basis? And I brought you the Rambam in source number 4, who spells out that it's the Anshe Knesses Hagdola. This is a classic Rambam with applications that we're going to be discussing probably all year. The Rambam talks about, I'm not going to read it aloud, I brought it here for you to see. But the Rambam says that when we went into Galus, we went into exile, many Jews started speaking other languages. And in the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, Ezra and his Beis Din say, you know what? We need a set text for davening in order to make sure that people will say the minimum that they need to say. That's why he enacts it. But again, it's during the second Beis HaMikdash that they're doing it. So Daniel isn't saying the fixed Shmona Esrei that I say today. He's saying something else 3 times a day, because he's in the end of the first Beis HaMikdash. And in the second Beis HaMikdash, we have a Shmona Esrei. Finally, source number 5. Mishnah in Tamid describes the morning routine of the Karbanos. And at one point during the Avoda, we're told, Amar lehem hamamuna, the designee would say to them, at this point it is time, Berchu bracha achas, bless one blessing. That's the bracha of Avas Olam, one of the brachas that precedes Shema. Vehein Berchu, and the Kohanim would then say that bracha. Karu Aseres Hadvarim. They said the Aseres Hadvarim, which you probably are more familiar with as the Aseres Hadibros, right? 10 Commandments. So they would actually say that as part of davening. Parenthetically, do you know why that stopped? Saying Aseres Hadibros as part of davening? Why don't we say the Aseres Hadibros as part of davening? Well, what's the reason to say them? Why should they be said? Why were they saying them? Well, now I don't know why they said them or why we don't say them. Something. So they said them, presumably, because that's the moment when Hashem actually speaks directly to us, is revealed publicly, nationally to the Jewish people. It's a highlight of our connection to Hashem. However, the problem becomes that people start to think that, okay, that's the core of the Torah, and I can just pick those things and follow those things. I don't have to worry about anything else. That's the downside of focusing on the Aseres HaDibros. So therefore they said, you know what? Let's not feed into that. Let's take that out of the daily davening. The Mishnah Berurah mentions that there were people who printed the Aseres HaDibros, I think on the walls of shuls or in Sidurim, and I'm forgetting now exactly what he writes there, but it's a problem because, again, people start to think that that's all you need to worry about. It was funny because about 15, 20 years ago, it was a big deal in the United States. There were courthouses that had the Ten Commandments on the walls of the courthouses, and those who argued that that's a violation of the Establishment Clause, the government is favoring a particular religion, insisted on removing them from the walls of the courthouses. And all the Christians were very up in arms and says, no, you can't remove them. But I thought that actually made a lot of sense because it makes people think that that's the only part of the Torah that you care about. You shouldn't, don't have those on the walls. We should put the whole Torah on the wall. In any case, that was part of their davening. And they said Shema, and they said V'hayim Shamoa, and they said Vayomer, the 3 paragraphs of Shema, and they recited 3 brachos, Emes V'yatziv, Avoda, that's Ritzei, Birchas Kohanim, which is Sim Shalom. So in other words, the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash are reciting things that we are familiar with as part of the davening. So whatever Professor Aviezer is thinking, and he is far from the only one to think it, this is an idea that is very, very popular. You'll hear people say this a lot, that the Korbanos are only that davening is a replacement for the Korbanos. It's a transition from a sacrificial system to a prayer system. The Gemara doesn't think so. And there's no reason to think that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would have thought so. Not only that, when you look, yeah.
I've always learned that, but don't they mean like in a set way, like the Korban like the Tefillah, and that with the fact that all of us say certain words as like reflecting the service of the Beis HaMikdash, not that it's the only reason for Tefillah, because it always did exist, but the 3 times a day and the order of prayer, like that, and it's not an untruth, and there just be more layers of it.
So the 3 times a day we just saw Daniel doing during the first Beis HaMikdash. Right?
Right, but it still wasn't institutionalized, right? Like the same way that did implements those and they weren't commanded yet. Like it wasn't institutionalized for the nation.
So it's the popularization of it. So then I would ask, what do you do with the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah in the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, who have Korbanos? Right? What would you do with that? Correct. The Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, as a term, will not appear in Tanakh. But the Gemara is describing what, as the Rambam calls it here, is Ezra Ubeis Dino. The idea that Ezra creates and institutionalizes this form of davening is actually linked to psukim in Sefer Ezra. It's something I want to come back to, not today, but like it's not just like someone saying, well, Ezra and his Beis Din were responsible. You can actually find this based on Sefer Ezra itself. Ditto the Takanos that we trace to Ezra, many of them are actually rooted in psukim. So how would I understand? If you've got the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which is Ezra's Beis Din, putting this together in the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, how could it be a replacement for the Korbanos? It just doesn't, if someone came along and said to me, I'm a secular historian, and I believe that it was post-temple replacement for sacrifices, so I couldn't disprove it based on these sources, because he'll say these sources are ahistorical. Somebody later came along and put these in, and I don't have archaeological evidence to dismiss what he's saying. But you can't tell me that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi thinks it, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is part of this system. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi buys into the Gemara in Megillah in source number 3. not only that, if you go back to Rabbi Shua ben Levi's own words, you realize that that's not what he said. He said, Tfilos keneged tamidim tiknu. They enacted them opposite the Korban Tamid. I don't think he means that it's a replacement for. I think he's saying something else. And that's what I wanted to discuss this morning, is what is this something else that he's actually saying? Because what I understand is that Tefillah and Korban reflect two different approaches to talking to Hashem, and they have unique roles. And what ends up happening is that Tefillah adopts certain aspects of Korban, and that's what they were doing with this Tfilos Keneged Tamidim Tiknu. We've talked about Korbanos on other occasions, right? We had a 2-part Parsha Shir last year, the year before, about rationales for Korbanos. We're not going to go through, why Korbanos at this point. That's just, otherwise we'll never get to Tefillah. But I want to look at where we find Korban in the Torah and where we find Tefillah in the Torah. Both of them are there from early in Sefer Bereshis. I'm skipping the Korban of Cain and Hevel because their Korban is not comparable to any of the Korbanos which followed thereafter. You can't compare Cain and Hevel with anybody else. Their situation is unique and really requires its own discussion, which is too bad, because then you could have had a nice Parsha Devar Torah for this week on Parshas Bereshis. Nonetheless, let's talk Tefillah first. I gave you on the sheet instances of verbal Tefillah found in Sefer Bereshis, and there are particular varieties. I did not bring translations for these psukim. In my email, when I sent out the sheet, I was going to mention that people might want to have a chumash with a translation at hand, but I forgot to mention that. I apologize. But we're going to explain them, and it's not like it'll be just the Hebrew. In source number 6, I bring you examples of Tefillah, which are of a particular kind. So the first one is Malki Tzedek. After Avraham has his victory over the 4 kings, right? The war of the 4 and the 5 kings. So, Umalki Tzedek melech shalem hotzi lechem vayayin v'hu chohen lekel elyon. Malki Tzedek, king of Shalem, right? We may associate that with Yerushalayim, brings out bread and wine, and he is some kind of a priest for Hashem. Vayivaracheyu, and he blesses Avraham, Vayomar, and he said, Baruch Avram lakel elyon konei shemayim va'aretz. Blessed is Avram to the highest God, the creator of heaven and earth. Uvaruch kel elyon asher migein tzarecha biyadecha, and blessed be this highest God, who put your enemies into your hand. Vayitelo maaser mikol, and then Avram gives him meiser. And that's what he gives to Malki Tzedek. How would you characterize that tefillah, that prayer? What's the goal of that prayer? This is an underhand pitch.
Praise.
It's praise and thanks, right? It's praise and thanks of Hashem. That's what it is. By the way, what halacha do we learn from a mistake that Malki Tzedek makes in this tefillah? There's a halacha to be learned from this. I think Rashi on the pasuk may even mention it. He gives Avraham a bracha first, and then he gives Hashem a bracha. Right? He honors Avraham, Baruch Avram, even though he mentions Hashem and honors Hashem in mentioning him. Nonetheless, first bracha goes to Avram, and the second one goes to Hashem, and that's a mistake. You're supposed to go the other way. So if somebody is having a l'chaim, the proper order for their saying l'chaim is make the bracha, drink something, and then say l'chaim. That's the appropriate way to do it. Some people have the practice that when they give their kids a bracha Friday night, so they actually do it after Kiddush because of this. Even though I think the widespread practice is to do the bracha for the children before Kiddush, some do it after Kiddush because first the bracha for Hashem, and then afterwards the bracha for people. Okay, that's just a side note. But if you turn the page, you find another example of such a tefillah from Leah. Vatar Leah vatele bein vatikra shmo Reuven ki amra ki ra'a Hashem be'ani ki ata ye'ehavani hi. She thanks Hashem for giving her a child. She acknowledges the child came from Hashem and says, boy, now this is great. Now my husband will love me. And then again after Yehuda, Hapam ode'es Hashem. I will thank Hashem. Even if the first one doesn't quite count as thanks, which you could argue, the second one certainly does. And she names him Yehuda, and then the story moves on. But these are tefillos of thanking Hashem. That's one variety seen in Bereshis. A second variety seen in Bereshis is requests. So in source number 7, I brought you the in Pasuk Chav Gimel that you see there from Perek Yirches. After Hashem has told Abram that he's going to destroy Sodom. So Abram approaches Hashem and he says, Ha'af tispet tzadikim rasha, would you really destroy tzaddik and rasha together? ... He asks Hashem, in the event that there really are tzaddikim among them, don't destroy them with the wicked. Don't destroy them with the Rishayim. Another example of a request is when Rivka, the last pasuk that I brought you in source number 7, when Rivka approaches Hashem when she is pregnant and she doesn't know what's going on inside of her, she says, I'm going to go, vatelech lidrosh es Hashem, to seek from Hashem some kind of counsel. It's unclear to me that that's really tefillah. I'm not sure. I set a hedge on that one. I feel like it is, but I can't say definitively. You could argue that it's not. And then another example of tshuva is from this week's parsha, not of tshuva, of tefillah, is from this week's parsha, and that's source number 8. After Hashem has decreed to Cain that he's going to be punished for having killed Havel, Vayomer Cain al Hashem, Cain says to God, Gadol avoni miniso. So some would read that and say, Gadol avoni miniso is a statement. However, commentators read it as tshuva, and saying to Hashem, it's also a form of tefillah, but it's a tshuva form of tefillah, saying, I have sinned terribly. This is the first time that we find somebody actually doing tshuva. Davening that is tshuva. So you have different varieties of verbal tefillah in Bereshis, and of course you also find karbanos. Take a look at source number 9. I brought you a scattering of these karbanos, one from Avram, one from Yitzchak, one from Yaakov. Stop me, by the way, if you have a question or a comment. Okay. So the first example there is, Hashem says to Avram, your children are getting this land, and Avram builds a mizbeach to God who appeared to him. Second example, Yitzchak, when he's digging wells outside of the Plishti land, Vayivan Sham Mizbeach, Vayikra B'Shem Hashem, Vayet Sham Mahalo, Vayichu Sham Avdei Yitzchak Be'er. He built a Mizbeach, declared in the name of Hashem, put his tent there, and they dug a well. And Yaakov, Vayizbach Yaakov Zevach Bahar, this is after Yaakov ran away from Lavan, and then Lavan caught up to him. Yaakov brought a Korban, and he called his brothers to eat bread, and they ate bread, and they camped on the mountain. Okay. Interestingly, by the way, very often in Bereshis, we find it mentioned that they built a Mizbeach. It doesn't actually say anything about the Korban. Did you notice the first 2 psukim that we brought there? Just says he built a Mizbeach. But I'm assuming building a Mizbeach comes along with a Zevach, comes along with a Korban. It will be an interesting point to argue the other way. So you have tefillah without karbanos. You have karbanos as well. One of the things that emerges here is that karbanos don't have the same mission as tefillah. And you can see that because some of the karbanos involve tefillah and some of them do not. So if you take a look at source number 11, right, the beginning of source number 11 is the same as what you saw in source number 10. Hashem says to Avram, your children are going to get the land. Avram builds a mizbeach to God. And then he goes on and travels, right? Mikedem lebeit el, sets up his tent, and he builds a mizbeach, and vayikra b'shem Hashem. So tell me something. When you bring a korban, do you daven? Based on what we just read in that first passage in source number 11.
Yeah.
You do. How do you know?
Vayikra b'shem Hashem.
That's interesting. So, what about the korban he brought in the previous pasuk? In pasuk Zion.
Okay.
No. Still in source number 11. Sorry. No. In source number 11. In our first piece that started with Vayavor Avram Ba'aretz.
Right.
So, in that passage, he brings two korbanos.
Okay.
Vayira Hashem al Avram Vayomel Zaracha Atenes Haaretz Hazos. Vayiven Sham Mizbeach Lashem Hanirei Elav. He built a Mizbeach, right? And then, Vayatek Misham Hahara, he moved, and he brought a korban. And Vayikra b'shem Hashem.
But what does it mean, Hanira Elav? There Hashem revealed himself, so he didn't have to daven.
Oh, so you're saying that's why he doesn't daven in the first one. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. It just looks like, to me, a straight korban. Hal Hashem Hanir Elav was the God who had appeared to him, saying, your children are going to get the land. I would have expected some kind of tefillah in response. But there isn't. It's just the korban. Now, you pointed out that in the second korban, the one that he does at Beit El, it says Vayikra b'shem Hashem. So the question is, what does Vayikra b'shem Hashem mean at that point? Is the wording Vayikra b'shem Hashem, does that refer to davening?
Maybe when one would bring a korban, if it was consumed, then you don't have to call Hashem, but maybe the fire didn't come down to consume the korban. Then you have to daven to bring Hashem to have more mercy to accept your korban.
Then I need a pasuk to tell me that. It's a great idea, but I would need a pasuk to tell me that. That sounds... Yeah, I mean... I would need information in the pasuk to tell me that in this case Hashem didn't answer first, and then he had to daven, and to explain why Hashem required that. I feel like it's got to be more. It's got to be something else. Now, I should know you're assuming something here, which isn't a bad assumption. Onkelos and Ibn Ezra make that assumption that Vayikra b'shem Hashem is actually tefillah. However, others disagree and say, no, Vayikra b'shem Hashem means Avram went to tell people about God. Avram came to Beit El, he built a Mizbeach, he brought a korban to Hashem, and Vayikra b'shem Hashem, he went out and told people about Hashem. However, I have to side with Onkelos and Ibn Ezra, because if you go back to source number 9, when Yitzchak built his Mizbeach, Vayikra b'shem Hashem, everybody understands that to be davening. So, it could be Vayikra b'shem Hashem means different things in different contexts. That's certainly possible. But just worth noting that the Vayikra b'shem Hashem here may mean davening and may not mean davening. Ramban thinks that it's not davening. He thinks that it's that it's teaching people about Hashem. It's odd, but my point in bringing this is to show you that korbanos sometimes involve tefillah, and sometimes they don't. That's really what I wanted to get across here. So if you keep reading in source number 11, you look at the pasuk that starts with Yudalid, Vayehal Avram. It says, Vayiven Sham Mizbeach Lashem, he built a Mizbeach. It doesn't say anything about davening. Now, it could be he davened and it didn't say so. Possible. Again, at the end of the Akedah, when he brings the ayah, when he brings the ram, it doesn't mention anything about him davening. It seems to be something separate. In fact, you could point out the other way. There are events in the Torah that cry out for tefillah that don't have a korban. That's something odd. For example, when Yitzchak is born, we don't find any reference to bringing a korban. When Abraham defeats the 4 kings, he doesn't bring a korban. So I need a better understanding of what the mission of korban is. What exactly is korban about? I think it matters not just in understanding korbanos, as well as understanding davening. So here's a possible and important difference between davening and korban in Bereshis, one which will explain more about what the korbanos are and when they are brought as well. I would suggest that korban in Bereshis, and again, I'm leaving Kayin and Hevel out of this, is a ritual that is meant to dedicate a place to Hashem. You build a mizbeach, you bring a korban. It tends to be performed by a family unit. In the examples that we see, we don't know anything about what kind of korban it is. Meaning, is it a korban olah where the whole thing is burnt? Is it a korban where you eat part of it? We don't get that information. But what is very clear is that every time Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov come to a new place, they bring a korban, dedicating it to Hashem. Take a look at the sheet. You'll see what I mean. Go back again to source number 11. Avraham travels through the land. Vayavor Avram ba'aretz ad mekom Shechem. He arrives in Shechem to Elon Moreh, and the Canaani are still in the land. And Hashem appears to him and says, your kids are getting the land. And he builds a mizbeach. That first site, right? Shechem / Elon Moreh is where Avram builds his first mizbeach. Then pasuk ches, vayatek misham ahara mikedem lebeis el vayeda halo. He moves east of Beit El, sets up his tent between Beit El and Ai, vayiven sham mizbeach lashem, and he builds a mizbeach. The next time Avraham moves is in the next line, Perek Yud Gimel now in Bereshis. Vayahal Avram vayavo vayeshev Elonei Mamre asher bechevron. He settles in Elonei Mamre, which is Chevron, and Vayiven sham mizbeach lashem. He builds a mizbeach. And then we find Avraham travel to the Akedah to sacrifice Yitzchak. And again, he insists on bringing a korban there. Avraham brings korbanos in the new places he arrives in. However, not everywhere. Not everywhere. We know of at least 2 places where Avraham travels and he does not bring a korban. What are they? He brings in Shechem / Elon Moreh. He brings at Beit El. He brings at Elonei Mamre Chevron. He brings at Har HaMoriah. Where else did Avraham go? They did not bring a korban.
Hebron.
Sorry?
Haran.
Haran was before he entered Israel. He doesn't bring one in Gerar, when he goes there after Sodom is destroyed. And he doesn't bring one in Mitzrayim.
Those things were bad.
As opposed to Canaan? What do you mean? So, I think what's going on is that he brings a korban to dedicate a place. And you can't dedicate other people's places. In other words, these are the lands that Hashem has promised I am giving to you. Gerar, and there's a lot to be said about this on Parshas Chayei Sarah. We had a shir on it 2 or 3 years ago. But Gerar is the land of the Plishtim. And Avraham tries for years to get a handhold there. But he never succeeds. And the moment he leaves, they fill in his wells. Avram never gets the kind of control in Gerar that he has in Hebron in the land of Canaan. The Plishtim don't give him that space. Ditto, Mitzrayim is obviously not his as well. It wasn't even promised to him. It was promised until Nahar Mitzrayim. Yitzchak does the same thing. If you follow Yitzchak, we saw the pasuk already earlier in source number 9. It was the middle pasuk. When he digs his wells in Be'er Sheva, he also builds a Mizbeach. Not in Gerar. Yitzchak does not succeed in Gerar either. And Yaakov does the same thing. If you look in source number 12, you find Yaakov's psukim. After he makes a covenant with Lavan, he brings a korban. Again, he arrives in Shechem. He sets up a Mizbeach. Again, in Beit El, after Shechem, he builds a Mizbeach, and he does it again in Be'er Sheva. The idea of bringing a korban is that you are dedicating a place to Hashem with a ritual. You follow? That's the pattern in Sefer Bereshis. And lest one say, this is a very fanciful idea, but can you anchor it in something? I mean, it seems to fit all the places where we find korbanos. I defy you to find me a korban or mizbeach in Sefer Bereshis that doesn't fit this pattern. But my anchor for it is a Mishnah in Masechet Shavuos, which discusses how you dedicate areas in Israel. If you take a look at source number 13, the Mishnah here is talking about Tumah. If somebody enters a holy place while they are Tameh. And it says, you're liable for entering the Azara, main outer room in the Beis Hamikdash, if you enter that while you're Tameh, and you're also liable if you enter Tosefes HaAzara, areas that were added to the Azara. Those areas also have to be handled in Tahara, in purity. And the Mishnah says, how is it that those areas that were added to the Beis Hamikdash became holy? And it tells us, here's how you add to Yerushalayim or to the Beis Hamikdash. You need a melech, a king. You need a navi, a prophet. You need Urim V'Tumim. The Kohen Gadol has to be wearing the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. You need the Sanhedrin of 71 judges. And you need 2 Karbanos, Toda, and Shir, and singing. And lest you say, where did they get that idea from? It seems to be based on Psukim in Nehemiah, Perek Yud Beis, where they dedicated the wall of Yerushalayim, in which, according to some, they had actually added a little bit to the north side of the city. There's some debate on this score because you didn't have Urim V'Tumim in the second Beis Hamikdash, so that's a fascinating discussion in its own right in the Gemara in Shavuos and the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBechira. But my point is that Korban, these 2 Karbanos Toda, are part of sanctifying land in the name of Hashem. And that's what's happening in Sefer Bereshis. That's the idea. On the other hand, think about all the tefillos that we discussed first, the davening that we saw first. Whereas the korban is a ritual, and it's a consecration of land, davening is about a personal relationship with Hashem. Davening is thanks and requests and tshuva. Davening is private. Davening is spontaneous. It's related to the events of the moment. And what I want to suggest is that those are the 2 poles. Korban is ritual. Davening is personal and spontaneous. And when we become a nation, when we stop being a family of the Avos, Korban transforms into an element of a relationship with Hashem. It's not only ritual for consecrating land, and Tefillah gains elements of Korban as well. In other words, both Korban and Tefillah evolve as you progress in the Torah. We become a community. We gain a central communal place to daven. In the Mishkan, eventually the Beis Hamikdash. We get special times to meet with Hashem and bring Karbanos. Those are the Moadim. And we gain a plan of entering Eretz Canaan, turning it into Eretz Yisrael. Davening remains in the Midbar. Where do we see davening in the Midbar? Like just personal, spontaneous davening? Where do we see an individual davening to Hashem in the Midbar?
When he asks for food.
Personal, not national. You're right, but personal.
Moshe davens to Hashem?
Yeah. Moshe davens to Hashem for what? Sorry?
Well, he davens to get them. They're not in the midbar, are they? Like when he davens after Egal, they're not in the midbar yet.
Well, that is Midbar. They're at Har Sinai. That would count. Yeah. He davens after the Egel. He davens on behalf of Miriam. He davens to be allowed into Eretz Yisrael. Right? Moshe davens to Hashem when a need arises. There's also spontaneous tefillah by the nation as a whole. Even before the Midbar, right? We daven to Hashem when we are in Mitzrayim. I brought you examples in source number 14, but I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm going to skip the examples on the page, but you can see them. They daven to Hashem again at Yam Suf, right? Az Yashir. You have national tefillah sometimes that is negative. When they say, hey God, we want meat. Although maybe that's not exactly the tefillah we want to be modeled on. But you have tefillah that is personal, and you have tefillah that is national. And these are spontaneous. They're driven by the events of the moment. But overall, in the course of the Midbar, tefillah becomes more national and more ritual, more like the Karbanos. We get formal, ritual, national prayers instituted. If you flip to source number 15, we receive the text of Birchas Kohanim. Kohanim don't just get up and say whatever they want to say. Ko tzivarchu es b'nei Yisrael. Here is what you are going to say. We get Mikra Bikurim. We're told that the Kohen, that the Jew who goes to the Beis HaMikdash and brings his first produce has a text that he's supposed to say before Hashem. Arami Oved Avi, thank you for giving me this wonderful land. We have Vidui Meiser. Every 3 years, you're supposed to declare that you have disposed of your Meiser properly, and that includes a tefillah. Hashkifa mima'on kadshacham and hashemayim uvareches amcha es Yisrael. Look on us and give us a bracha, Hashem. Bless our land. You could argue that Shema is included in this, although I'm not so sure that Shema counts as a tefillah. That's subject to some debate. But you get formal, ritualized prayers like you have formal, ritualized karbanos. You also get a special place where you're going to recite those tefillos, right? First, the Mishkan. I brought it in source number 16. We're told, Kol mevakesh Hashem, those who want to see God, Yetzei al Ohel Moed, go out to the Ohel Moed. And the Mishkan is supposed to be a site to come to Hashem. And then finally there will be the Makom Asher Yivchar, the place Hashem will choose in Israel. There will be a particular location. That's much more like Korban than it is Tefillah. In Bereshis, you daven wherever you are. Suddenly, there's a place I go to, which will of course end up being the place towards which I daven, when Shlomo says, as we mentioned earlier, that they're going to go to, when you can't go to the Beis HaMikdash, you daven towards the Beis HaMikdash. And not only that, but you also gain times for davening. Tefillah starts out anytime, but it gains times. And that's what we emphasize in source number 17, which the Gemara picks up on. Abraham rising early in the morning, Yitzchak speaking with Hashem in the afternoon, and Yaakov with his davening to Hashem at night. Parenthetically, it's very interesting. There's a Gemara in Yuma, Daf Chavches, in which Abraham is referred to as davening once the walls start to get dark from the shadows. And he's davening mincha. And Tosfos says, Abraham davened mincha after Yitzchak enacted it. That's Tosfos' resolution. But in any case, we find them davening at particular times of day. while a Korban always has a fixed time, right? The Korban Tamid, the daily Korban, morning and evening. So much so that now we look at source number 19, which Professor Aviezer quoted in the beginning, and I think we'll come to a better understanding of what this Gemara is saying. Itmar. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina Omar Tfilos Avos Tiknum. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said that Tfilos were enacted by the patriarchs. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Rabbi Shua ben Levi Amar Tfilos Keneged Tamidin Tiknum. Rabbi Shua ben Levi says, no, they are parallel to the Korban Tamid. Then the Gemara shows you sources to support Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, source to support Rabbi Shua ben Levi, and then it tells us Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina actually didn't mean to say that the Avos enacted our davening. That's not true. He says, Tfilos Avos Tiknum v'asmechinu Rabbanan akarbanos. Tfilos were enacted by the patriarchs, and the rabbis came along and tied them to the times of the Korbanos. In other words, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov had times they preferred to daven, and the Chachamim tied davening to the times of the Korbanos. So davening becomes more like Korban. You follow? It now has particular occasions to be said. It has the influence of the location. It has certain minimum things that need saying. Korban, interestingly, also becomes a little bit like davening, in the sense that we get introduced in Vayikra to Korbanos that are not about dedicating a location to Hashem, but instead are about thanks or apology or celebration, like davening is. But that's a side note. But now I want to go back to what we started with in the beginning. Professor Aviezer's read, when he says that Tefillah is created to replace the lost Korbanos, that's how he understands what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying. I don't think that's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying. What Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is trying to say is that davening was created initially with the spontaneity of the Avos, and then elements of Korban were introduced to give it ritual. That's asmechinhu rabbanan akarbanos. The rabbis made them more Korban-like. Our reasons for davening are varied. Sometimes it's just I want to tell Hashem what I am feeling. I need to orient myself toward Hashem. I need to improve myself. All the different reasons that are given for davening. But fundamentally, at its core, it's personal and spontaneous. But over the course of the Torah, it becomes more like a Korban. So when we daven, we're actually implementing two different things. We're implementing, on the one hand, spontaneity, personal emotion, and on the other hand, fixed ritual. And both of those are supposed to be expressed. That's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to channel both. So that what I want to do next time is talk about the fixed Amida, the fixed Shmona Esrei, and where it comes from, how it does this, what is it that we're trying to do with it. I think that's where I would want to move to in this sort of overview introduction on Tefillah. Nechama, you unmuted. Did you want to say something?
No, I also wanted to ask you a question. Could it be the fact that we evolved as a people, we became a nation, so therefore Korbanos and Tefillah had to become merged and had a different meaning to it, whereas when the Avos and it was more individual, you have a different responsibility community-wise, interacting with more people, so it's a different type of Tefillah and prayer.
Mm-hmm. So I think it certainly can be. I mean, we didn't really address the question of why they blend. I think the fact is a nation has needs that are different from those of an individual, and this will accomplish that. So I think you're right. I think that is a piece of it. I think also, go back to what I had said a little bit towards the end, it ensures that people are actually going to do something. And that's something that the Rambam picks up on when he talks about the establishment of Shmona Esrei. Making sure that it's going to be said a certain number of times a day, making sure that it's going to be said with the influence of a particular location, make sure that a certain minimum of things are going to be said. Those those are all reasons which I think, you're right. Once you become a nation, become more important. So I think that's true. So one thing that I'm not sure. Yeah. Sorry?
What did the people do that were the people that were not able to give karbanos during the time of the Beis Hamikdash? They just said their personal prayers?
So karbanos have two varieties, basically. One is obligatory ones for an individual. I'm not talking about the communal ones, not talking about personal ones. And the other is optional. So if a korban is optional for somebody, they can choose to bring it or not bring it. So, for example, a person is allowed to bring a korban olah on any day, a burnt offering. On the other hand, you have a korban that's a requirement, like a chatas. If they did something wrong, they violated a deoraisa, certain mitzvahs, they required that you bring a korban. Then they had no choice. They had to bring it. So anybody who was following these rules would have brought such a korban. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
My question, those that didn't live in Yerushalayim, that
right.
were, that weren't able to have access to the Beis Hamikdash, what did they do if they committed a crime or violated something that?
So right. So they would actually travel to Yerushalayim. They didn't bring the animal. The animals were sold at the site of the Beis Hamikdash. So you didn't have to bring your animal there. You just would buy it on site. Often what people do is that they come for Aliyah L'Regel. They would go for Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, and then they would bring the korban then. You follow?
Oh, you wouldn't have to give a korban. Yeah, you wouldn't have to give a korban right after you committed that sin or violated something. You would wait.
So a little bit depends on what kind of korban it is. Meaning, if a person takes a vow, there's a halacha of bal ta'acher. You're not allowed to delay bringing your korban. However, as the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains, you have a lot of time before you're in violation of that. There is a general principle of zrizin makdim in lemitzvos, that you should always do things as soon as possible. And certainly a person who committed an avera should want to do tshuva as soon as they can. And they should do tshuva. But in terms of bringing the korban, they did have the leeway to wait until they were going to Yerushalayim for the regel. They could wait, yes. One request that I would have from you, and in general from the group, is just I'm not really sure when we're dealing with tefillah. Number one, the question I asked in the beginning, do we want to angle one way or angle a different way in terms of what we look at, specific tefillos, overview, goals of tefillah, methods of tefillah. I'm not sure which way we want to go with it. And then the other is recognizing there are different levels within the group. I'd like to try to find a way to do this in a way that challenges everybody, but doesn't lose anyone. I'm not sure exactly whether when you're dealing with tefillah, whether I'm hitting that mark. So if it's something that you feel like, you want more of a challenge, more thrown in, I'm happy to do that. If you feel like, like it's, nope, this is a good level, that's fine also. Just, give me some guidance, please, because when you're doing tefillah, it's really important that it fit the group. And it's true with all Torah, but certainly when we're discussing tefillah. Okay. So thank you very much, and look forward to next week, God willing.